This week on Filthy Hope.
The first thing that comes to mind is trust. There's just this deep trust in I think where there isn't trust, I think it's very hard to be high functioning, and it's very hard to be collaborative. It's very hard to be honest and vulnerable.
This episode of Filthy Hope was produced with the support of our Patreon members. If you want to support us here at Filthy Hope Studios financially, the best and easiest way to do that is to head over to patreon.com/filthyhope and become a patron. For just the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you get access to every episode a day early, totally ad-free, and a bonus 20-minute segment of Filthy Hope, exclusive to Patreon members. You'll also get early access to things like merch and tickets for live events. Once again, that is patreon.com/filthyhope to become a Patreon member. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Filthy Hope. If it's your first time here on this podcast, we spend time in the grey spaces where Jesus, life and culture intersect. I'm your host, Pastor Jonty Cornford, and on this episode we're going to be hearing very shortly an interview that I had with the Rev Dr Andrew Ranucci. If you're unfamiliar with who Andrew is, he works with a ministry called Soul Life, working with ministry teams and pastors and ministers to build better teams and better relationships amongst teams to be more effective and better at their job. So we'll be hearing a little bit about that. So some stuff about, what makes pastors and ministers tick and work well as a team. But I think in general, a lot of what we talked about that you'll hear shortly there are lots of lessons to be learned that can be applied to everything, whether it's relationships or how we work as individuals and how we work just in teams in general, whether that's in our families, in our relationships, in our work lives, all different spaces. So hopefully this interview is something that you can get something out of. So without further ado, I'm going to jump straight over to this interview and I will see you on the other side. Alrighty, well, joining me on the podcast, we have Andrew Ranucci. Welcome. How are you?
Hey, great to be here. It's a privilege. Thank you.
We're
doing great.
Super thrilled to have you. Maybe as a way of introducing you, we, on a previous episode, Ness and I talked about some discipleship cycles that we had talked through and worked through our kind of feelings around what that looks like. For people that may not have listened to that episode, go back and listen to that. That actually came out of one of a number of sessions that Vanessa and I and the rest of the team at Uniting Heart and Soul have been doing with Andrew. So could you briefly explain what those sessions have looked like, and that will segue us nicely into what you do.
Thank you, Jonty. It's been a lot of fun working with the Heart and Soul team over the last year or so, and just to see you asking all the great questions of what does it mean to be a disciple? What does it mean to have a strategy and a model for discipling your congregation, and then really starting with a very fresh whiteboard and thinking about the whole process of discipleship from I guess some influences from a book called The Critical Journey, some great writing around the different stages of faith that people go through, and then being able to see all of you wrestle with what it means for us as Heart and Soul. How do we really lead people on a very honest and transforming journey of discipleship, and not leave them like stunted, allowing them to go through those stages of questioning and uncertainty, and seeing them go through that deeper place of faith that I think we all, if we stay with faith, if we all eventually get to the other side of the wall where we actually become a lot more peaceful with the unanswered questions, where we're able to hold that tension of a deep trust in God, and without needing all the answers. And I think it was just beautiful to see the way that all of you wrestled with those later stages, which are not a lot of churches end up wrestling with, because they're harder stages to actually find a way of engaging people with. It's been a great journey, and I'm excited to see the way Heart and Soul are going to unfurl that in the ministries that you guys offer.
Yeah, and for people that are interested in life at churches, a lot of what Ness has been doing in the pulpit on Sunday morning since a lot of those sessions has been specifically to do with a lot of that stuff around the sessions that we did with you, and therefore how Uniting Heart and Soul as a church is going to approach discipleship and through those different stages and cycles. So if you're all interested in hearing some more of what that looks like for us, go see Ness preach on a Sunday morning, because she's been doing a really cool job of unpacking some of that stuff. But those sessions that we've been doing with you, we've gone to you because of Soul Life, which maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that is, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, look, I basically have been a local church pastor for around 28 years, and then when I turned 50, I really felt drawn to, rather than being in the trench of the local church, supporting pastors in the local church. And so I established a ministry called Soul Life. I also work with another organisation called Partners in Ministry as well that does a very similar work. And basically, my heart is for pastors. That's my world. And I guess I know the great challenges in how to maintain a healthy soul in the life of a pastor. And I also know how healthy a church can be, and how beautiful a community can be within the church when the pastor is really healthy. But I also know that the opposite can happen. When a pastor is depleted, that can also have a great negative impact on the community life of a church. So I guess my desire is to see churches be the healthiest they can be in Australia. And in fact, I'll just come back from the US and working with churches in America as well. And I have a real heart to see pastors steward their lives and their souls really well, so that they can minister from a place of joy and security and freedom and hope and strength and vitality. Because I really believe if pastors are flourishing, then churches and those communities will really flourish as well. So I guess that's my heart. I love serving in the local church for all those years, and now I get to live vicariously through a whole bunch of pastors that I get to work with, whether it's one-on-one mentoring relationship or with teams like yourselves.
I'd be really curious to hear. This is a topic I'm very fascinated by when I talk to people. What did that? You mentioned you're in congregational, like local congregational ministry. What did that transition look like for you? And maybe, I guess take me back to that time when you had started to think about moving to the sort of role that you're in now. Was there a sense of calling, do you think, that drew you towards that direction? Or take me back to that time and maybe paint for me, what was that transition like, and what was the drive?
Look, it's a great question, and I don't think it was like one moment. It's a bit like falling asleep on a train in Germany and you end up in Italy, and it's like, when did I cross the border? I'm not sure, but I crossed the border at some point, And so probably for 10 years prior to 2018, when I finished up at Coast Community Church, I was engaging more and more with pastors, running pastors retreats, mentoring pastors in our denomination. And so my world was starting to slowly grow in serving pastors. And at some point, it just I guess it swapped around. My energy was increasing for working with pastors, and I just found that my energy was decreasing for the local church in my context. And I had a 2RC who was on staff whose energy was increasing to lead the church. We had a staff team of about 12, and they're a very stable team. And my associate was ready to take it on, and I really felt a real peace and at ease even though it was like giving up a child,
Mm.
because we birthed it back in the early '90s. It was a beautiful opportunity to see the church continue to flourish under the next leader, and also I felt a great energy about moving on to sowing my life into the lives of pastors.
Mm. I guess in a follow-up question to specific to where you are now working with pastors, what do you think are good, like what are signs of ministry teams and pastoral teams that are working really well? What do you see as those key indicators of ministry teams, whether they're individuals or groups, that are really functioning at a high level in pastoring the communities?
Wow. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is trust. There's just this deep trust in I think where there isn't trust, I think it's very hard to be high functioning, and it's very hard to be collaborative. It's very hard to be honest and vulnerable. So I think what I see, like in the heart and soul team, is just this incredibly high level of trust with one another, and therefore I see a lot of vulnerability and a lot of collaboration. That's why it's so much fun working with you guys. And honestly, I wish every ministry team had those elements, because sometimes it's really heartbreaking when you see ministry teams not reaching their potential collaboratively because the trust just isn't there at the level at which it could be, for whatever reason. So there's lots that flows downhill from that, but I would say trust would be the big one. And then obviously there's the respect that everyone has for each other, the way that team members can celebrate one another's strengths, the way that team members can receive one another's constructive encouragements, the way that a team can celebrate one another's wins, and keep the big picture in mind. I think a very destructive element of teams is when team members get siloed, and where ministry areas get siloed, and people come together for a team meeting, but they're all very much thinking about their own silo as the most important silo. And I just don't see a team working to its greatest capacity when there's a silo mentality, but where everyone has a sense of deference to the other, and there's a desire to actually see the church be flourishing and healthy and vibrant, above just their own personal area of responsibility. There's just a few things.
Yeah, well, I think there's so much to learn maybe there in just hearing those things, in identifying maybe, even if for I know probably most of our listeners aren't pastors or ministers, but in just hearing what those indicators are of really good functional relationships, really,
Yes.
in how to maybe identify some of those things where that can be worked on, and to improve relationships in general. This episode of Filthy Hope is brought to you in partnership with the new podcast from Filthy Hope Studios called Into the Word. Rev Ness and Pastor Jonty, your hosts here on Filthy Hope, will be hosting short, sharp conversations around a single piece of scripture, helping you on your daily journey to dive deeper into the Word of God. This new show from Filthy Hope Studios will be launching on Wednesday, the 3rd of April, and will have its own podcast feed separate from this feed here on Filthy Hope, although we will also be publishing the first handful of episodes right here on this feed too. If you're watching us on YouTube, then Into the Word will be coming to you right here on Filthy Hope Studios. So we invite you to tune in with us from April 3rd as we bring you weekly bite-sized doses of Bible, helping you on your journey into the Word. So I guess maybe a follow-up question would be possibly, we've talked about some of the positive indicators of really good functional teams. What are maybe some of the most common things that you've noticed as identifiers of teams that maybe aren't as functional as they could be?
Wow, I wish I had these questions earlier, Jonty. I might have been able to think about the answers. I guess it is the flip side. You know, when you do see distrust, when you do see um, individuals who are more interested in their own advancement rather than the advancement of the team. When you see people coming to a team with their own personal agendas rather than the vision of the team as being central. So I guess selfishness is a part of that. There's a sense that for all of us, we all struggle with a bit of selfishness. But I guess when we allow that to become more important than what we are doing as a team, I think that's really becomes very destructive. I guess insecurity, the inability to receive constructive criticism, I think is a real problem on teams. I think when team members are walking on eggshells around someone, that's an indicator that it's not going to be a very healthy team. And so being able to be honest and truthful and vulnerable, I think, is really important. But again, if there's a lack of trust, it's very hard to do that. And I get that for team members. If they've been vulnerable in the past and then they felt unheard, they haven't felt validated, they're not going to probably try again. So I think leadership needs to also be very, very affirming, and they need to be validating everyone's vulnerabilities. But I think if teams can be built on trust, then I think it really does answer a lot of the questions that flow downhill from there.
Yeah, and I think again, there's so much in there that applies to relationship in general. That relationships
Absolutely.
that are built on trust just function at a higher level than relationships that are when you're treading on eggshells with someone, or there's just not that trust there, or all manner of different things.
That's right. And if there isn't trust there, then I guess it just poses a great question. Why isn't the trust there? And why can't we talk about it? And I think that's the biggest problem, is when we can't talk about it. And so I would encourage people, if they are in a team where there is a lack of trust, wonder what it would take to be courageous enough to raise it as an issue, and I wonder what it could look like for your team to deepen its capacity for vulnerability and trust.
That's that. I think that's such a valuable thing to think about. Something that we have spent a lot of time talking about in our sessions together with our team is this idea of discipleship and how to guide people through various different seasons or cycles. If people want to hear more detail about what some of the specifics, what our team at Uniting Heart and Soul we're talking about, there'll be a link to some of that stuff down below. But for today's conversation, I guess a question I would have for you is, what do you see as, like, how maybe for you personally, but also in guiding, whether it's other pastors or even back to your days in congregational ministry, how do you keep people's discipleship journey fresh and exciting? Because a lot of the time, I think it's probably a universal experience as a follower of Jesus to suddenly reach a point where, whether it's the wall, which is something that we've spoken about before, or any number of different things where the train can just suddenly grind to a halt. How do you think, are there some ways that you've found that work in, whether it's yourself or encouraging others, to keep that discipleship journey fresh and vibrant?
Yeah, great. It's a great question, and I think if I had the answers, I could write a book and probably make $1 million. So yeah, I don't want to. That's right. I don't want to answer it in a simplistic way, because it is a really important question that theologians have wrestled with for centuries, and so I don't want to minimize the question. But I think what I found helpful is to think about discipleship more holistically. There's a reason why I called our ministry Soul Life, because I really believe that we are souls, that we are integrated beings, that I take this from some of the work of Dallas Willard in a book he wrote called Renovation of the Heart, where he talks about the soul as having 5 components. And I think for me, it just helped me understand that I'm not just a spirit. I have a spiritual life, but I also have a mental life. I have a mind. I have an emotional life. I have a physical body, and I have relationships. And those 5 areas are a really important part of who I am. I'm not just my mind. I'm not just my emotions. I'm not just my spirit. I'm not just my body. I'm not just my relationships. But all of those different elements are my integrated self. That's me as a human person. And I see discipleship as following Jesus with all these 5 elements, and being able to broaden my discipleship so that I'm seeking to be a really great disciple of and a steward of my own life. And so obviously there's a spiritual element to that, and how we steward our life with God. And I guess that's where we start. And I think probably that's the pointy end of your question. And I think our life with God is a relationship. I love the fact that in John 15, Jesus says, "I no longer call you servants; I call you friends." Well, how do we steward friendship? Friendship means it's a relationship. Means that we spend time with one another. Means that we find ways to be present to each other. And there are lots of spiritual practices that help us to do that. And for the last 2,000 years, Christians have found all sorts of traditional, spiritual practices that have helped them to nurture their relationship with God, whether it's, reading scripture, or whether it's worship, whether it's prayer, whether it's times of solitude and silence, whether it's fasting. There's just a range of different spiritual practices that help us to become aware of God's presence in our life, and draws us more deeply in our relationship with Him. But I also believe there's no limit to the amount of spiritual practices that we can also have. I don't think there's a defined limit. So I encourage people, and my world is I work with pastors. I encourage pastors to think about, well, what are the creative spiritual practices that we can engage with? I talk about a friend of mine who has a spiritual practice of making a cup of coffee in the morning and wrapping his hands around the cup of coffee, and as he does that, he pauses for a moment of prayer and just feels the warmth of the mug, and just thanks God for his love for him for that day, and then he seeks to pray that, look, God, help me to be a loving presence to those who I'm with today. Help me to be aware of the warmth of your love throughout the day. And in some ways, that is now a spiritual practice for him. And as I started to think about spiritual practices going back 2,000 years, what were the elements that turned something into a spiritual practice, whether it was fasting or prayer or worship or reading scripture? And I came down to 4 simple things that I think every spiritual practice in essence has. And so therefore, we can actually be creative and find spiritual practices that are out of the box if they can do these 4 things. And I'll talk about one of my creative ones in a minute. And these are the 4 things. Firstly, a spiritual practice helps us to become aware of God's presence. Secondly, a spiritual practice helps us to gain a revelation from God. So in some ways, God speaks to us about his truth in some way. Thirdly, spiritual practice is a practice that we do that helps us to respond to God. So we're invited to respond to him in some way. And the final thing is that a spiritual practice will ultimately shape us to be formed in the way of Jesus. So it will over time just help us to be shaped more like Jesus. So one of the things that I started doing was exploring kayaking. I love to get out on the water, on pit water, and go kayaking. And I thought maybe I can turn kayaking into a spiritual practice. And it actually has become a spiritual practice. So I can get out on the water, and when I'm out on a beautiful still morning with in winter you got that beautiful little layer of fog, and the water's glassy, and I just become aware of God's presence around me. Sometimes I'll see an eagle soar, and I'll stop paddling, and I'll just look up and just be in awe of God's creation. I'm wrapped in God's presence, and then that invites me to listen. What's God saying here to me? And God speaks to me about His sovereignty, that He's got all the world, in His hand, that I can trust Him, that He's feeding the birds of the air, and He'll feed me. I don't need to worry about anything. I gain a revelation of God's immanence, of God's capacity to meet the needs that I have for the day, and then that invites me to respond to Him in prayer, of being thankful, of worshiping Him, and then I think it ends up shaping me in the way of Jesus, because I finished that time feeling a lot more centered on God, a lot more grateful, a lot more trusting, a lot more peaceful, and so look, going out kayaking can be a spiritual practice. So I think one of the ways that we steward and keep our spiritual lives fresh is by finding spiritual practices that help us to do those four things. And if you've been stuck in the rut of just a couple of spiritual practices and they've become boring, they've just become duty rather than delight, then I would encourage you just stop doing them. To find some new, fresh spiritual practices that help you to become aware of God's presence, help you gain a revelation about Him, helps you respond to Him, and will ultimately then shape you in the way of Jesus. And so I just encourage people to experiment, find some new ways, and make sure that our practices aren't done out of a sense of obligation or duty, but they ought to be done out of a sense of delight and joy and freedom.
I love that idea of doing things out of a sense of delight instead of duty, because I think certainly as in the world of ministry, as pastors, ministers, I think often we confront that question because we are kind of taking part in, whether it's the liturgy or the pastoral care or the preaching, all the different avenues that the ministry lends itself to. We find ourselves bumping up against this question of like, are we just doing this because it's duty, or are we doing this because it brings life? And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That extends to all aspects of spiritual practice and spiritual life. If it isn't life-giving, if it isn't, actively drawing us into the mystery and the wonder of relationship with Christ, then it's worth taking it to one side and examining it. And I love. Can you maybe just remind me again what those four elements were? Because
the four fundamental elements of a spiritual practice, and this is just my thinking. So this isn't law. It's just my own thinking. A spiritual practice is something that will help us become aware of God's presence.
Yeah.
So I think we would all agree that reading God's word, worshiping, fasting helps us become aware of God's presence. So this works, for the traditional practices as much as it does for any experimental ones we want to try. Spiritual practice will help us to create the conditions for us to hear from God. So when we're reading God's word, we hear God speak to us through His word. Sometimes in worship, the words that we sing will hear God's truth back to us. I think solitude and silence is a beautiful practice to be able to hear from God, especially be out in nature. So we hear from God. The third thing is that a spiritual practice helps us to respond to God. So it's not just a one-way conversation, it's a two-way conversation. A spiritual practice invites us to respond, whether it's in prayer, whether it's in worship, whether it's in delight, whether, there's a sense of as a response from us back to God, of thankfulness, of gratefulness, maybe a request. So there's a sense of a two-way interactive conversation happening with a spiritual practice. Then the fourth one is that a spiritual practice will ultimately shape us in the way of Jesus. So over time, we will be spiritually formed by the practices that we engage with. And that's true in life anyway. Every person is continually being formed by those things that they give attention to. And so spiritual formation is choosing for Jesus to form us. And spiritual practices help us to be shaped in the way of Jesus. So that's how I see. So those four things: awareness of God, hearing from God, responding to God, and being shaped in the image of Jesus.
I really resonate with that idea of that you're being formed just by default, and being able to choose what is forming you.
That's right.
I really like that, and I think that's something that probably unconsciously I've been really trying to stay on top of in recent times, and so I think putting words to it that way is really helpful. In you're going to be transforming into your future self constantly.
Absolutely.
And so taking responsibility and choosing the things that are going to form you over time, I think is such a valuable thing to be cognizant of. I really love that. Yeah.
Awesome.
This has been wonderful, and I encourage people to, if anything that we've spoken about today really resonates, and you think that this is a conversation that would be valuable for you or a team that you're a part of, I really encourage people to reach out to Andrew through Soul Life. There'll be some links to that down below. Maybe is there a way that people can get in contact with you that's the best way to get the ball rolling?
Through my website, soullife.org. There's a way that my email's on there, so people can reach out, or teams can reach out. That'd be fine.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and if people listening have had thoughts or questions or anything that they want to follow up with us, you can always email us at filthyhopepod@gmail.com, or of course on socials. And I'll be bumping into Andrew every now and again anyway, so I'm sure I could pass on anything that comes through. We really encourage people to reach out and continue the conversation if anything that we've talked about today has challenged or resonated or any of those things. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you joining us.
It's a pleasure, Jonty, and to all your viewers and listeners. Thank you for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you very much. We'll see you guys next time.
Hello, it is me, Pastor Jonty, coming to you from the set of Filthy Hope, interrupting this episode just briefly to tell you a little bit about one of our new ventures here at Filthy Hope, which is our blog. If you're a fan or a listener of what we do here at Filthy Hope, then you might enjoy getting more of that in the written form. So whether it be reflections on some of the topics that we talk about on the podcast, or just other topics that we are interested in at the moment, whether they be theological, religious, cultural, maybe about a film or a book. Ness and I are going to be writing some pieces and also some guest writers over there. So if that sounds like it is up your alley, then go and find it at unitingheartandsoul.org/filthy-hope. The link for that will be down below in the show notes of this episode. We hope to see you there, and we hope you enjoy it. But that's all. Back to the episode.
And we're back. That was our chat with Rev Dr Andrew Ranucci. Like I said in the interview, if you have anything you want to follow up with us about or with Andrew, email us, please. We'd love you to get in touch with us at filthyhopepod@gmail.com if you want to continue the conversation, or you can send us a message on social media. We would love to hear from you if you have any more thoughts, questions, queries, anything that came up for you as a result of that interview. And like I said before as well, if you want to get in touch with Andrew about being in partnership with him and doing linking up with him in a professional sense, if you've got a team or a group that you think would benefit from some training, I can vouch for him from firsthand experience. He's wonderful at what he does. Us as a team, but also me individually, I think, and Rev Ness as well, can definitely say that as a team and as individuals, we have grown so much over the last couple of years, having worked with Andrew. So the links for that will be down below, and his email address if you want to get in touch. To round out this week's episode, I thought I would very quickly answer a question that was sent in from a listener asking about what are some other good faith-based movies to check out. So we've just finished, in the lead up to Easter, we did a handful of episodes of looking at movies about the life of Jesus in the lead up to Easter. So we talked about Jesus of Montreal, The Life of Brian, the Monty Python film, Last Temptation of Christ, the Scorsese film, and of course Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. To varying degrees, I would obviously recommend all of those movies if you're interested. They're all made very well, depending, regardless of how you feel about the movie itself and the subtext. I think they're all entertaining movies that are definitely worth your while. But thank you for the question, and in answer to your question, I have a bunch of them that I think hopefully at least one of them you'll get something out of. And if you like them, feel free to jump back in our inbox and let us know. Or if you've seen any of these, feel free to jump in our inbox and let us know what you thought. The first one is a film that we've actually talked about on this podcast before, back in the early days. First Reformed, written and directed by Paul Schrader, who also wrote The Last Temptation of Christ, the film that we talked about a few weeks ago. So yeah, I won't speak too much about First Reformed, having done an entire episode on the podcast. So if you're interested in hearing our extended thoughts, I made Rev Ness watch it with me as well, of course. There'll be a link to that episode down below. But it's starring Ethan Hawke as a pastor in the United States struggling with his faith, and where that intersects with some tough feelings and convictions around climate change and climate catastrophe, and where his faith, without spoiling the film, I guess, charges him to take some drastic action driven by his faith and his desire to save the planet. So really highly recommend that one. From memory, it's pretty hard to find. You may have to rent it on Apple if you want to seek it out. I don't believe it's streaming on any of the streaming services at the moment, but if you can find it, highly recommend that one. Similar to that one, I would be surprised if this next film didn't directly influence First Reformed, is a film by Ingmar Bergman, a Swedish filmmaker, called Winter Light. That is very, very similar to First Reformed. It's about a pastor in a small town struggling with his faith, almost identical to First Reformed in a really good way. I think as a almost remake of Winter Light, First Reformed works really well. And if you've seen First Reformed, I highly recommend going back to see Winter Light as well, directed by Ingmar Bergman. They're very similarly excellent films. Another one that we've spoken about before on this podcast that we haven't actually spent time talking about in depth is Martin Scorsese's Silence, is a film starring Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver as missionaries as they head into Japan to try and spread the gospel, and also on the trail of Liam Neeson's character, who is also a missionary who word has gotten back to them in their home country that he has given up the faith and become an apostate. And so they've heard this and they are on a mission to try and find him, save him, but also spread the gospel in Japan when that is against the law of the time. And it's a really, really tough thriller following them through feudal Japan, evading authorities, and it goes to some really tough theological places, including the question of, does giving up your faith for the sake of saving other people, saving the lives of others, is that a more noble act in the eyes of God than staying true to your faith and letting others die as a result? The title of the film, Silence, comes from this idea of what do you do in response to the silence of God. And it's based on a novel as well by Shisaku Endo, which I highly recommend if you if you're a reader and you want to get onto that one as well. But that is Silence by Martin Scorsese. I would highly recommend that one. If you're into horror, which obviously I am, listen to the show will know, The Exorcist. It's a classic. If you haven't seen it already and you're at all interested in movies, The Exorcist is just, I think, a perfect movie, and really in great detail it goes into the faith and the struggle of a man faced with the problem of evil, something that as Christians inevitably we are going to encounter, and something The Exorcist does really well, that a lot of quote-unquote Christian movies don't even go near, is unpacking what a person of faith's response can and could be in the face of the problem of evil. Again, ages and ages ago we did an episode talking about The Exorcist, so I will link that down below if you want to hear. Again, I made Rev watch that movie again, probably for the first time in 30 or 40 years, and she did not enjoy it, but that, as is our job here at Filthy Hope, sometimes to watch movies that we don't like, so I'll link that episode down below if you want to hear some more thoughts on The Exorcist. A few more honourable mentions before I talk about what is possibly one of my favourites, is The Gospel According to St. Matthew by Pasolini. You may have heard of Pasolini's most controversial film, Saló, known as one of the most controversial films of all time. If you're not aware, you may be shocked to hear that, as well as that movie, which is rightfully one of the most controversial and sometimes hard to watch movies of all time, he made a really, really great gospel film, The Gospel According to St. Matthew. Highly recommend that one if you can find it. Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life is also great, as is Darren Aronofsky's Mother, which is pretty tough to watch at times. Again, similar to The Exorcist, if you're not a horror fan, Mother might be pretty tough, but if that's something you're interested in, genre film, looking at creation myths and biblical narrative told through allegory, highly recommend Mother by Darren Aronofsky. The final one I want to mention is Alfonso Cuarón's Children of Men, based on the novel by P.D. James as well. For those that have seen the film, you'll know that it's not explicitly a Bible or faith-based film, but subtextually it's really obvious as an allegory of the virgin birth, and a bunch of other things. The basic setup of Children of Men is that humanity have lost the ability to reproduce. So in that sense, it is almost a post-apocalyptic film. The film takes place, it starts the day that the youngest person on Earth has died. So humanity have not been, no new babies have been born for years and years and years, and our main character sees the news that the youngest person, or previously the youngest person alive, has passed away. So it's this, I guess, this setup of, as opposed to a lot of post-apocalyptic films where the end of the world is this sudden, big, extreme event that happens immediately in the course of 24 hours. This is a slow, protracted death for humanity. So societies and countries have collapsed, and it takes place in London, in England, which is one of the last countries to still have a government. And our main character discovers, or is shown by a group of, I guess what you would call eco-terrorists or fundamentalists or activists, have discovered that there is a young lady who is pregnant, the first pregnant human, the first woman to fall pregnant in years. And it's his job to get her across the country through some very strict borders and militarized zones to the right people. And are they the right people? Can they be trusted? Is part of the tension in the film. So very obviously there are some parallels there between that and the virgin birth story of Christ, particularly when you look at the subtext of the gospel narrative of Jesus' family being refugees. And there are some very, very, vivid and evocative parallels, not only between the film and the gospel narrative, but also with the current political and climate situation today on Earth. And it came out in 2006, and just so many of the images and ideas in the film were so far ahead of its time and prophetic in what it was depicting. So I would highly, highly recommend that one as a, I guess you'd call it a thriller. There's some really incredible set pieces, some incredible cinematography and acting, and it's known for having 2 or 3 really incredible long takes, some one-ers where some insane action takes place without the camera cutting over minutes and minutes and minutes of screen time. But yeah, if you're looking for a film that dives into themes of faith and religion in ways that aren't overt, but is also just a really excellent thriller, I would highly recommend Alfonso Cuarón's Children of Men, which came out in 2006. All of those movies I will put links to down below if they're on streaming, and if not, some places where you might be able to find them. Thank you for the question. Really appreciate it. And if you want to continue to contribute to this show, like I said before, filthyhopepod@gmail.com is where you can email us, or you can find us on socials, or you can join our Facebook group where we interact directly with our listeners there. The link for that will be down below. As always, if you want to get this episode a day early and ad-free, you can do that by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/filthyhope. You'll also be getting extra segments of the show there exclusive to Patreon members. Next week is our 100th episode, which is super exciting. So tune into that one next week, where we will be diving into a bunch of questions from you, the listener. So without jumping the gun, thank you for being with us for almost 100 episodes. We can't wait to celebrate with you next week. And of course, if you're a listener of Into the Word, I'll see you tomorrow over there. That just about does it. We'll be back. RevNess will be back next week for our 100th episode. And we will see you then.
This is a prayer for the people who want to give up, who have been hurt beyond repair and cannot bear to see your face in anything. Find peace in letting go of the guilt that is in yours, and find hope in understanding. Life is not a game you have to win. Forgiveness overwhelming, salvation undeserving. You are loved by something beyond, someone beyond understanding. Drink deep and taste the fullness of life in community.